Over the course of time, narratives have evolved to fit the era they were made in. I want to look at this change of narrative over the course of the last couple decades, primarily through the action-adventure series JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, written by Hirohiko Araki. The series started in 1987 with its first part, Phantom Blood. This first part has a very simple adventure, with the stereotypical kind-hearted hero Jonathan going on a quest with his friend and mentor to defeat the evil Dio. The narrative of this part of the story is an emulate of popular fantasy movies of the time, such as The Princess Bride and The Dark Crystal. The story was focused more on the journey of the characters and less on the characters themselves, who remained static throughout the entirety of the story. Films released in this era followed a similar path, focusing less on the characters in the story and more on their journey. This was because Hollywood at the time was focusing more on the innovation of special effects, with massive breakthroughs in VFX in movies such as T2 or Jurassic Park. That's not to say there weren't films in this era with character-driven narratives, but they were far less common. However, the structure changed a lot in the fourth part. Instead of being a cross-country adventure, the part only took place in one town, making the part feel more grounded compared to the others. This grounded feel is really emphasised with how the villains of the part are written. The early villains of the series were over the top, with crazy designs and over-ambitious goals. However, the villain of the fourth part, Yoshikage Kira, is more realistic, has a simpler design and less ambitious desire. Another thing that becomes more apparent in this part is how the characters are more focused on rather than the adventure they go on, as we get to look at their lives around the town, as well as their growth over the course of the story. In the fifth part, Araki combines the large-scale journeys of the early parts with the more developed side characters of the fourth. An aspect that makes this part stand out a lot is the fights, as Araki uses these fights to tell narratives on their own. The most notable change in this part, however, is with our protagonist, who is much more morally ambiguous than the previous characters. Earlier parts would rarely ever kill the villains of their stories, either putting them in a position where they no longer could fight or redeeming them. However, in part 5, they rarely spare the villains. This more ambiguity deepens in the sixth part, as the main cast is made up of criminals in a prison. At this point, we also get our most interesting protagonist, Jolene, who is very unlike the other protagonists. Instead of remaining static throughout most of the story, she starts off as a timid but immature character, as we see her get into fights very often, or taken advantage of by other characters. However, in the course of the story, we see how Jolene matures over the story, as we see her become braver and less selfish, often risking her own life for her friends. Jumping ahead a couple of decades, we see how much the narratives of JoJo's has changed. The narratives are more focused on the characters of the story and their own personal journey. The protagonists are much more developed in these later parts, as we watch them grow over the course of the story. For example, the protagonist of the seventh part, Johnny, starts the story as an arrogant, scummy celebrity. However, over the course of the journey, we watch him grow to become a more respectable person by the end. This brings me on an aspect of JoJo's I've neglected to mention at this point. Often in the story, Araki would name characters or their abilities after songs and artists. Very few of these early references didn't add much to the characters, rarely connecting to their personalities or narrative. However, in part 7, we can see how Araki uses these references to build on these characters. For example, Johnny's ability Tusk is named after the Fleetwood Mac song with the same name. The structure of the song reflects Johnny and his own abilities' growth over the course of the story, starting off slowly growing larger and stronger by the end of the story/song. However, these newer protagonists are much less heroic than the previous mentioned Jonathan, as we see that these characters are only pursuing their own goals. Johnny is fighting to regain the use of his legs. Josuke from the 8th part is fighting for his memories and identity, however is extremely brutal while fighting enemies, and Jodio from part 9 is fighting to become rich and doesn't care for anyone in his way, with Jodio even being described as a scumbag by Hirohiko Araki himself. These are all unlike the previous protagonists of the series who go on their journeys with the sole purpose of vanquishing the evil of the part. The narrative has also changed with how the villains are written. Whereas the earlier villains were developed to be eviler with very little character traits outside of that, the villains of the latter parts are much more developed. Funny Valentine, the villain of Part 7, opposes Johnny's selfish journey to regain his legs, with his own selfless goal to gain the power to protect his country. However, in contrast with Johnny, Valentine is less honourable, killing his own men with little to no care, whereas Johnny often hesitates when it comes to killing the villains of this part. Aspects like this makes the audience question which character is truly in the right, Johnny or Valentine. In the 8th part of the series, JoJo's, we see this parallel again with the main antagonists, the rock humans. Josuke and Jobin, the secondary antagonists of the story, are both fighting to save their family with the use of a special fruit. In contrast, we have the rock humans, who are fighting to use said fruit to save humanity, which is much more selfless. However, behind these selfless statements is a much more selfish goal, as their real intent with the fruit is to destroy human society. Once again, the audience is asked the question of who truly is the correct one in this scenario.
Dr. Coconut, look out, here he comes.
Part 9, the JoJo Lands, uses the antagonists of the story to highlight societal issues. Despite only having 21 chapters of the story as of writing this, the JoJo Lands has already introduced multiple characters who represent the corrupt nature of our society, as villains are made up of CEOs, lawyers, and other service workers known for corruption. There is also a rise in narratives that challenge our perception of the society we live in. More and more media texts are highlighting the corrupt aspects of society, such as Oscar-winning films like Parasite and Joker. Narratives back in the 80s and 90s were much simpler, with stories of good versus evil. However, as time goes on, we've seen a decline in these stories, with more stories challenging these tropes and the very society we live in.